In this video, I'm going to be showing you some more 3D tools to help you make 3D objects to print in Photoshop. So I'm here in Photoshop, and the first thing we're going to do is get some vectors to work with, because we're going to be using extrusions. And extrusions are really useful because they allow you to create objects in 3D out of any vector shape. So I'm going to go ahead and select this circle in Illustrator just to start out with something basic and paste it into Photoshop. And when you're looking to make an extrusion, a path is the best way to go. So I'll click Path, and I'll just have that selected in the Paths tab. And then the Layers tab, I'll create a new layer because I don't want the background wrapping around this new object I'm going to create. So I'll have the new layer selected. And in the 3D panel, I'll click Create 3D Extrusion, and as the source, I'll use the work path. And then I'll click Create. When you do this, it'll put you into 3D mode. And if I turn the camera around by clicking this background and then using the orbit tool, you can see that it's basically created a cylinder, because if you make an extrusion out of a circle, it'll make a cylinder. So you can see that this is really good because you could do this with other things like logos or type, and so there's just a lot of possibilities of things you could do with basic extrusions. But Photoshop also gives you some other tools to make your extrusions more robust and complicated. So if I click on the object itself, or click on this layer 1 down here in the 3D panel, under the Properties tab, and if you don't have this, you can add it, through the Windows drop-down menu. There's some different things that you can do. The first one is just changing the extrusion depth. So if I turn down the extrusion depth, it'll just enlarge or shrink the depth of the extrusion to make a shallower cylinder. So that can be really useful. But then there's also these other tabs here, like Deform, which gives you some more options. In addition to extrusion depth, you have this thing called Twist. And when I turn up Twist, it doesn't really do anything in this case, because if you twist a cylinder around its axis, it doesn't actually look any different. But if I had something a little bit more complex, it would create like a screw-like form. So you can play around with Twist to see if that works for you, but I'll go ahead and zero that out because we don't want to twist in this case. And then there's also this thing called Taper. And what Taper does is it takes the extrusion, and instead of it going out at a 90-degree angle, it tapers it up or down. So if I turn this taper to 0% and then rotate the camera around, what you can see is it actually created a point because it tapered it from this end and tapered it down to 0%. Go ahead and select the object again, go back to Deform, and if I click 200% instead of 0%, you can see now what it did is it tapered the object up so that it's almost kind of hard to see. Let me zoom out the camera a little bit here. But you can see that it basically tapered it so that the diameter of the exit point was actually 200% of the diameter at the entry point. So taper can be really useful. But let's go ahead and turn that back down to 100%. And then there's also this thing called Bend and Shear. So if I turn up the, oops, there we go. It's getting a little laggy on us. Go ahead and select the object again. So if I go ahead and change the angles, oops, there we go. If I go ahead and change the angles in here, you can see that it's starting to rotate this object around the x-axis. And this can be really useful because you can create rotations out of things. So if I go to 360, you can see it actually rotated all the way around that axis. And now what I have is actually a sphere, because if you take a cylinder and wrap it around, it'll create a sphere. So let me go ahead and turn that off back to 0. And you can also do that with the y-axis. So if I turn this up to, let's say 180, you can see that it actually rotated this around and created this weird shape because the cylinder rotated around the y-axis, and so since it's only at 180 degrees, it hasn't finished rotating. If I turn this to 360, it would be yet again another sphere. So go ahead and play around with those tools. They could be really useful for creating unique shapes. And there's also Shear, which is basically where you're taking the extrusion and, oops, let's go ahead and change that to Shear. Okay, there we go. You can get a little bit laggy. Okay, let's zero that out. It's being a little laggy on us here. Let's change this to Shear. Okay, there we go. So this is Shear. Shear basically takes the extrusion, and instead of going straight out at a 90-degree angle, it's going to go up at an angle. So in this case, we're going up on this axis at a 50-degree angle. So it's creating sort of an oblong shape. So that can be really useful as well. let's go back here and zero that out. And things can get a little bit laggy in Photoshop. And if it's getting really laggy, you might even want to check your 3D settings, which are in the preferences in Photoshop. So let's go ahead and zero that out. And then let's go to this next tab, which is called Cap. So Cap allows you to create bevels and inflations on your extrusion. So if I go ahead and create a bevel here, you can see what it's doing is it's chopping off this edge so that instead of it being completely flat, there's a 45-degree angle. And that profile of the bevel is going to be determined by this contour shape. So if I go down to a curved contour, let's select the half round here. Oops. Let's try that again because the thing wasn't selected. Okay, there we go. You can see now it's a rounded contour instead of a flat contour. So that allows you to do, a bunch of different things with your shape. There's also the angle here. So with 45, it's going to apply that curve or that bevel shape directly from one to the other. If you go to something more steep, it's going to be a much more curved bevel that's going to come out really quickly and then end really rapidly on the other side. Or if I turn it down and actually go negative, it'll actually bevel it inwards. So there's a lot of different possibilities you can do with beveling. Let's go ahead and turn that off for now. Then the other thing you can do is inflate. So if I turn up strength here, you can see that inflate basically like bubbleizes this side. And so at 14% with an angle of 45%, it's going to start out at 45 degrees and then it's just going to bubble it over. So you can kind of create this rounded cap shape, which can be pretty useful. And then you can apply this to the front side, the back side, or the front and back. So if I go to front back, you'll see it'll apply that bubble to both sides. So that can be really useful as well. So those are the basic things you can do with extrusions. Let's try extruding a more complicated shape. So go ahead and delete that layer. And let's go ahead and create a new path for us to work with. Go back to Illustrator and I'll select this ampersand. There we go. Do the same thing where I put it in as a path, select that path, create a new layer again, go to 3D, create a new extrusion from the work path. And there we go. So really cool. You can create all kinds of things like this ampersand. And what you might want to do is sort of add this ampersand to a different layer to kind of combine it together. So if you kind of think like you were making some kind of poker chip or some kind of tag that had your logo extruded, kind of imagine that this ampersand was your logo, you might want to take this and shrink it down and then apply it to kind of a cylinder shape. So let's go ahead and show you how to combine those two things together. The first thing we're going to do is actually take this shape and just reduce the extrusion because it's really, really big for something like a logo. So we're just going to take this and slide it to something a little bit more manageable. There we go. That looks pretty reasonable. And then let's go ahead and bring in another cylinder. So we'll take our shape here, paste it in, and actually we don't have to because we still have this on the work path. So we'll use that again, and we'll create a new layer, and then we'll make another extrusion from that object. And so when you're combining two objects together in Photoshop 3D, you actually start them out as two separate layers. So right now, this cylinder and the ampersand below are actually in completely separate 3D environments. They're not related to each other at all. So what I'm going to do is first prepare them and then merge them into one layer. So let's go ahead and select in the 3D tab our layer here and turn down this extrusion as well because this is also looking too deep. There we go. So we'll make it about like that. And let's also scale this up just a little bit as well. There we go. We'll just click our thing and just scale it up. Oops. Let's rotate our camera around. There we go. And we'll just click in the middle here and just scale it up. And sometimes it could be a little bit finicky. Oops. There we go. That's looking better. So you just have to kind of work with it when it gets finicky like that. Don't worry too much about it. Okay, so now in our layers panel, you'll see I have two 3D objects. You can tell it's a 3D object because it has this little cube here next to the thumbnail. And what we want to do is merge them into one scene. So if I select both of them, this one and this one together, and then go up to 3D, there's a option called Merge 3D Layers. So we'll go ahead and select that. It'll take a second, and basically it'll combine these into one scene. So now I have one layer, and if I go to 3D, you can see I have layer 1, which is the ampersand. I'll go ahead and move the camera so we can see that a little bit better. Oops, it's actually being covered up, but layer 1 is actually this ampersand. It's underneath the cylinder. And then I have layer 2 here, which is the cylinder itself. So the first thing I want to do is kind of rotate these so that they're in reasonable places relative to each other. And this can be really tricky to kind of align things together. And that's why the ground plane can be really useful. Because when things are rotated in weird situations, it's really hard to get them to align precisely. But the ground plane provides a reference point for that to happen. So let's go ahead and select our cylinder here. And then in Properties, we're going to go to this last tab, which is called Coordinates. Coordinates allows us to move things with numbers rather than sort of arbitrarily. So if we actually go ahead and just click Reset on the position, it's going to move it back to the ground plane. And if we click Reset here on the angle, it's going to rotate it back to its original angle, which is actually a pretty useful angle for us right now. And then if we go ahead and click 90 degrees on the x-axis, you can see it's going to rotate it relative to the x-axis. So now we have sort of this puck that's sitting flat on the surface. So now we're a little bit more organized, which is a good thing. So now let's do the same for the ampersand as well. We'll click that or select layer 1. We'll go to Coordinates. We can reset the position, reset the angle, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll just rotate it on its back. So there we go. Now we have the ampersand and the puck in one place. And let's go ahead and just move the camera around because, oops, and that's actually the wrong thing. So there I accidentally moved the ampersand, and what I actually want to do is move the camera. So whenever I do that, I want to click Current View first, and then I can just move the camera around. There we go. And also just slide it out a little bit so we're a little more zoomed out. There we go. So now we have these two layers. The next thing we're going to want to do is just move the ampersand up so that it's in the correct place relative to the puck. So we'll go ahead and select that, and then with the move on the z-axis hovered, we'll just go ahead and slide it up, and you can see it's kind of emerging straight out of the puck. And you know, the depth of this is up to you. It doesn't have to be like perfectly aligned. If you just have it partially buried, that'll change the final shape. So there we go. And there's, if you have current view selected and you click on this camera icon here, there's these, all these default views. And these can be really helpful for just visualizing things in certain ways. So for instance, if I go to top-down view, I can see exactly where my two shapes and how they're aligned. And in this case, maybe I actually want to align this just a little bit differently. Maybe it wants to come just a little bit up. There we go. And then I can go to like a side view, and the side view again is going to give me this perfect side view so I can make sure that things are aligned. So sometimes if you go to side view, you'll notice like, there we go, just a little bit laggy. But you'll go to side view and you realize, oh, there's a gap between the two objects. So going to side view and all these different views just to check it out to make sure you're aligned perfectly is always a good idea. There we go. So that's how we merge these two objects together. So now if I just take the orbit view, you can see we basically have this finished shape. So the last thing we want to do if we're going to print this is actually go ahead and go to 3D and go down to Unify Scene for 3D printing. Sorry, sometimes it's a little hard to find. And this is actually going to take this mesh that we've made and combine them together. So right now these are still two separate meshes, and for 3D printing we actually want to combine it together. So it's a little bit like the Pathfinder Unite tool in Illustrator. So I'm going to do that. Sometimes it has to think for a while. In that case it was pretty fast, and it's just going to merge these two things together. So now we're pretty close to 3D printing. The last thing we want to do is go to 3D and go to 3D print settings. And this is how you're going to prepare your file to export it for the 3D printer. So when you click on this, you'll get this thing in your properties panel here that's going to give you a bunch of options on how to print this. So we're going to print to a local thing here. And what we want to do is actually create a file specifically for the 3D printer we're using. And at City College, we have the Replicator Z18, the MakerBot. So we're going to go ahead and click that as the printer. And what it's going to do is create a situation where the file matches the output settings that that printer needs. So go ahead and do that. And then there's some different options here. This resolution thing actually controls how fine of a detail the output is on the printer. So medium is the best default. You might want to go to high resolution for certain things, but it's going to take much more time. And low resolution is generally going to be a little bit too coarse for the scale that we're working on. So generally medium is the way to go. Then you have a few other things here like scaffolding and rafts. And what the raft does is it creates a flat plane to print on. And usually you want to create a raft, but in some cases, including this one, I actually might want to click off the raft because I already have a shape that's perfectly flat on the bottom. So there's no need to print on a raft. If you're printing, say, a sphere, you can imagine that you would need something to hold the sphere steady as it prints. And once the print is done, you would actually pull off the raft. So it's a really thin material that's just going to keep things steady as you print. And same with scaffolding. Scaffolding is if you have things that stick out far from your print. So for instance, if you were printing a T shape and the T was standing straight up, the arms of the T would want to fall down as it was printing. So the scaffolding is going to create this whole support structure for you that's going to support those arms as you print. So generally you want to just keep all that stuff on. And once you have this set up, you can go ahead and click this button here. And when you click this, it's going to just go ahead and create the file for you. And sometimes it's going to take a while, so be patient with it. Occasionally you'll get some kind of error, but usually it'll work after just a little bit of thinking. So it'll bring up this window when it's ready, and then you can just click export. And when you click export, you can just go ahead and save this image to the desktop as whatever file you want it to be. And it's going to save as a .makerbot file. And if you put that .makerbot file on a USB, you can actually bring it directly to the USB port on the printer and print directly from it. Just make sure you coordinate with either some kind of lab tech or professor to get that done, because setting it up can be a little bit difficult. And if you want to change colors of the substrate for the 3D print, that can be a little bit of a process as well. So just make sure you coordinate with someone, but that's all you need to do to make a 3D print. So hope that's helpful, and in the next video I'll be showing you a few more tools to add complications to your 3D prints. So see you then.